It seems a little funny to start a video game history series on my channel all the way back with the 6th generation of home consoles. But if George Lucas can start Star Wars all the way on episode 4, then all bets are off, right? And really, what better place to start examining the history of this hobby that we love than the one and only generation where all of the major players in the industry were active in the console market at the same time. That's right, Generation 6 was the only one to feature mass-market home consoles from all 4 heavy hitters of home electronic entertainment: Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, and Sega. One was entering the market, one was on the way out, and 2 others were continuing to cement their positions, albeit on very different trajectories. It's an era where millennial and Gen X gamers were growing up, and the games industry was growing up right alongside us. So let's take a look back at the moments we remember and the moments that matter in this inaugural edition of the Save Files, as we revisit the Console Wars Generation 6 4-player action. Hi, and if you're new here, welcome to the Friendly Xennial Gamer. I'm Owen, and I've been enjoying covering and connecting with viewers about the modern games, platforms, and gadgets that we know and love today. But as much as I love being on the cutting edge of gaming as an early adopter, nostalgia is a big part of what makes this hobby special to me. And if you've ended up here on my channel, then I'm willing to bet that nostalgia and gaming go hand in hand for you too. So I've been wanting to step back from the day-to-day business of the games industry today and take a look back at the history of the hobby in a new feature on my channel that I'm calling the Save Files. Now, my goal isn't an encyclopedic recitation of video game history. There are a lot of great channels that do that really well. What I want is to present something of a flashback from lived experience, to jog our system memory, so to speak. And I really want to get to the how and the why. How did each platform choose to approach the generation, and why did they succeed or fail? And more importantly, how were gamers actually experiencing their games, and why does each generation really matter to those of us that were there? And what better way to start the Save Files than with a series on a topic that we all love to hate and hate that we love, the Console Wars. Now don't worry, this is still the Friendly Xennial Gamer, and it is a hype and fanboy free zone. I'm not here to take sides, just to look back at the console generations and the experiences that shaped gamers during them. But rather than go all the way back to the beginning, I want to start with the 6th console generation, to explore where each of the 4 major players were at this pivotal point in video game history. So let's get into it as we kick off this first episode of the Save Files, the annals of the Console Wars. Guys, it says anal.
Actually, that's anals, plural.
Just get rid of it. We'll just call it the Console Wars. Sorry. I have the worst production staff. Anyway, it was the year 2000. We had survived Y2K and the new millennium was off and running. Xennial gamers like me were deep into high school or off to college. Gen X gamers were getting jobs and starting their families. We were all young adults learning how to fit gaming into a post-childhood life, and fighting the lingering perception that it was something for kids, something to be left behind. And we proved otherwise with our wallets that year when the PlayStation 2 debuted and was a bona fide hit. And while the Nintendo GameCube and the inaugural Xbox wouldn't reach those same heights when they arrived in 2001, Sony's runaway success with PlayStation 2 cemented the 6th generation as the moment that the home console became a permanent fixture in the living room entertainment center. No longer relegated to the playroom, during this generation, a home console became a table stakes piece of consumer tech for a lot of families. It was an era where the world was changing. Here in the US, kids of the 80s and 90s were facing a reality more complicated than the one we'd grown up in. Hanging chads were leaving elections in the balance, and news of terrorism was creating an eye-opening sense of fear that we hadn't known before. It felt like we were growing up fast, and as we were maturing, our games were maturing too. Adult themes became more prevalent in the cultural conversation, just as many of us were reaching R-rated movie and M-rated game age. And as the internet became a part of daily life, gamers were starting to get the first taste of online gaming creeping its way into the home console world. And it was actually Sega who took the lead on that online front initially. But to discuss Sega's 6th generation console, the one that sadly would be their last, we need to go back before Y2K all the way to 1998, and the launch of the Sega Dreamcast. See, by the mid-90s, it was clear that something was rotten in the state of Sega. The one-time Japanese giant had delivered a 4th-generation breakout contender with the Sega Genesis, holding its own against the Super Nintendo. But in the wake of that success, they had endured a 5th generation that was sloppy at best and a catastrophe if we're being honest. The Sega Saturn, which had released just 3 years before the Dreamcast in 1995, was a miserable failure in the important US market, despite a decent launch in Japan. And look, I could get deep into the weeds here of everything that went wrong for Sega in the mid-90s. From ill-advised experimental accessories like the Activator, which I had and literally played one time, don't judge me, to confusing and somewhat ill-advised Genesis add-ons like the Sega CD and 32X, to the wildly expensive and badly timed Saturn. So they went all in. They tried to herald the arrival of the 6th generation of consoles on their own terms and on their own timeline. They launched the Sega Dreamcast in Japan on November 27th, 1998, and then in North America, Europe, and Australia the following year. And it's funny, I can remember reading gaming magazine articles about the Japanese launch and being intrigued by the Dreamcast all throughout that year. Magazine articles. Kind of tells you how long ago this era was. This was like 30 years ago. The idea of a console launching in Japan and not hitting shelves in America until a whole year later seems crazy by today's standards. Products come to market globally much faster these days. But with their reputation tarnished from the Saturn debacle and with the N64 and PlayStation squeezing them out, Sega needed something new on shelves in their home market in order to try to turn the tide. And pre-launch signs were encouraging. Pre-orders were strong. But Sega couldn't meet their own demand. The cost-effective chips that they'd chosen for the Dreamcast to keep prices down were in short supply, forcing them to stop taking pre-orders and selling out of all available stock within hours of launch day. Still, critical reception and buzz were solid, and Sega spent big on marketing. A $300 million worldwide promotion budget around a campaign to make the system feel modern. And they changed up their look entirely. Gone were the deep reds and blues and the 80s arcade-style fonts of the Genesis and Saturn era. Dreamcast, with its orange spiral and clean white hardware, felt friendlier. And the accessories? A few of them were genuinely kind of ahead of their time. The controller had a slot for virtual memory units, the VMU, which not only let you save games, but enabled unique gameplay features. And honestly, it was the VMU that convinced me to scrape together money from my job waiting tables at Johnny Rockets to get myself a Dreamcast. I remember being able to use the screen on the VMU to call plays in the Sega Sports NFL titles, and the person sitting next to you on the couch couldn't see what play you'd picked. That was legitimately pretty cool. And for a minute there, having a Dreamcast was kind of a flex for a gamer in their late teens. There was no question it was more powerful than the N64 and PS1 it faced at launch. When friends came over, you could wow them with games like Soul Calibur, which made the 3D on PlayStation and N64 look like relics by comparison. And I was just enough of a tinkerer and an early adopter to take advantage of the Dreamcast's built-in modem, the first on a home console. Not many games took advantage of it, but the ones that did signaled a real tide change coming for console gaming. And priced competitively at $199, the Dreamcast had a pretty decent US launch. They rolled it out on September 9, 1999. Sega set their own record, moving nearly 250,000 units in the first 24 hours and 500,000 within 2 weeks. A successful European launch followed, but Sega stumbled with their Australian rollout where virtually no stock was actually available on launch day. But the bigger problem wasn't their internal struggles, it was the competition that was about to come from the outside. And as a Dreamcast owner from launch, you could feel it pretty quickly. The games were great, but the software delays just piled up early, and if you had your ear to the ground at all, you knew trouble was coming. Because while Sega's fortunes were hanging in the balance, Sony was about to take all of the wind right out of the poor Dreamcast sales. Sony had entered the home console market with the original PlayStation in 1994, and it was a successful enough debut to immediately establish them as a serious contender. By the time they announced its successor, the original PlayStation had moved triple the units of Nintendo's N64, 100 million PS1 units to about 33 million N64s, and they'd moved 10 times the units that Sega had moved with the Saturn. So when Sony announced the PlayStation 2, the momentum was already on their side. But they didn't just grow during the 6th generation. They dominated. After years of rumors, Sony confirmed their first PlayStation 2 details in March of 1999. And where they'd been somewhat cautious in rolling out the original PlayStation, company brass were now enthusiastically proclaiming their pride in Sony alongside the PlayStation name. And the details they shared truly shook the industry. PlayStation 2 was announced to be fully backwards compatible with PlayStation 1 games. This was the first home console to offer that kind of functionality. That was huge. We had grown up through multiple generations where a new console meant leaving behind everything that you'd already collected for the last one. I stopped playing my NES the moment that I got my Sega Genesis because that was the one hooked up to the TV now. But the idea that PS2 would play my entire PS1 library, that was a genuine game changer. And Sony wasn't talking about specs in their announcement the way that hardware companies usually did. They described what they were building as being capable of unlocking video game experiences that could convey unprecedented emotions. At the Tokyo Game Show in September 1999, they promised movie-quality 3D graphics in real time. That language hit different. We'd tasted early polygonal 3D graphics on Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1, and I, for one, was hungry for those graphics to get deeper, more layered, and more real. Sony was promising exactly that, and the way they were talking about PS2 robbed the Dreamcast of any momentum that Sega had hoped to maintain. But there was something else, something that in retrospect was maybe the biggest factor in their success of all, and it had nothing to do with games. PlayStation 2 could play DVDs. At a time when dedicated DVD players were still mostly too expensive to be true household items, Sony was effectively bundling the hottest new home video format into their console. Now, the PS2 wasn't the best DVD player on the market, and there were plenty of moms and dads who weren't going to pick up a DualShock controller in order to watch a movie. But for a lot of households, the PS2 became their first DVD player. And as someone who worked at Blockbuster from the transition from VHS to DVD, I can tell you, people were really passionate about DVD when it started becoming available. So Sony had built something that could blow every other console available out of the water on games and deliver the hottest new format in home entertainment. That was almost an impossible hand to beat in retrospect. By the time PlayStation 2 launched, first on March 4th, 2000 in Japan, then in North America that year on October 26th, the hype was massive. PlayStation 2 was the first time a midnight launch became a genuine media event, and I was at one. I'd called in a favor to a manager at the KB toy store I'd worked at during high school, and I'd secured a pre-order. And if you hadn't pre-ordered, you were out of luck. Maybe more than any console that had come before it, the shortage of PS2s got wall-to-wall coverage in the media in the US. Teenagers and 20-somethings were lining up at Circuit Cities, Toys R Us, and Electronics Boutique all the way through that first holiday season, and still coming up empty. And importantly, the games delivered too. Madden 2001 looks rudimentary now, but compared to what had come before, it hammered home that you had something genuinely more powerful on your hands. And PS2 launched with the DualShock 2, dual joysticks right out of the box, where the original PlayStation had shipped with no joysticks at all. Sony was making sure that their hardware could actually take advantage of the 3D muscle under the hood. And by the end of December 2000, they'd sold about 1.5 million PS2 units in North America alone. And that's compared to only 5 million total Dreamcasts worldwide in more than a year on the market. And then came the moment that for me and for a lot of gamers sealed it completely and sent me to GameStop to trade in my Dreamcast for store credit. Grand Theft Auto. Specifically, Grand Theft Auto 3. A game that had started life as a planned Dreamcast release. By late 1999 and early 2000, it was already leaking in game forums and early sites like IGN that Rockstar Games had made the decision to move development to PlayStation 2. Citing the Dreamcast's technical limitations, but really the commercial reality more than anything. And for the small but passionate Dreamcast owner community, that was a real gut punch. And it was the writing on the wall. When I got my first look of Grand Theft Auto 3 running on PlayStation 2 at my brother's house in October 2001, my passion for gaming was entirely reignited. The 3D worlds of Mario 64 and Tomb Raider, games that I loved, were rendered obsolete in an instant. Here was a real city, teeming with life, calling out to be explored, with a Goodfellas-style story driving the whole thing. I could do an entire Save Files episode on Grand Theft Auto, and maybe someday I will, but suffice it to say, that game really became Sony's killer app for the PlayStation 2. It shipped exclusively on Sony's system well into 2002, and its cultural impact is impossible to overstate. And PlayStation 2 would go on to sell 160 million units worldwide, gaming's greatest success still to this day. Conversely, the Dreamcast had totally stalled. And in an announcement that was shocking at the time but not surprising in retrospect, Sega officially discontinued the Dreamcast on March 31st, 2001. They couldn't compete with Sony on hardware, and it no longer made financial sense to try. So, we gather, dear viewer, to mourn the end of Sony as a gaming hardware company. The Dreamcast had left genuine classics behind, but it sold just over 9 million units in its lifetime. For context, 11.6 million copies of Grand Theft Auto 3 shipped for PlayStation 2 alone. So Sega would move on to developing third-party gaming titles for their former competitor systems. And honestly, they continue to do that to this day, so you can't say it was a bad business call. But as a couch gaming kid of the 80s and 90s, it still always makes me a little sad. Sega will always have a special place in my heart and on my shelf. So with the Dreamcast gone and with PS2 sales booming all through early 2001 in the lead up to GTA 3, was Sony suddenly in the driver's seat to dominate the video game business untested? Well, dominate they did, but not without at least some competition from a returning champion and from a fresh-faced competitor. And that returning champion was Nintendo. Since the Nintendo Famicom launched in Japan in 1983, later branded as the Nintendo Entertainment System for its US debut in 1985, Nintendo had become synonymous with home video games. It didn't matter what console I was playing on. To the grown-ups in my life, I was just playing Nintendo. Idiots. Despite Sega's challenge, Nintendo had mostly maintained their dominance through the 4th generation with the Super Nintendo. But the 5th generation Nintendo 64, while a genuine favorite for many, one of mine included, it saw a significant drop-off. A divisive three-handed controller, a smaller cartridge library, and Sony's PlayStation outselling it 3-1 left Nintendo in a position that they hadn't occupied in a very long time. And by the time both the Dreamcast and the PS2 were on the market, it felt like Nintendo's crown might all of a sudden be slipping. And I can remember the early 6th gen silence from Nintendo being kind of strange. In the previous generation, there had been months of buzz about the Ultra 64 before it was revealed and branded as the Nintendo 64. But with the N64 on the market and games like Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye, and the Pokemon series keeping fans occupied, Nintendo wasn't tipping their hand about what came next. And they were also awfully busy in the handheld market. Nintendo kept mum on their plans until May 12, 1999, announcing their 6th generation console with the codename Dolphin, with a graphics processor with the codename Flipper. Dolphin? Yeah. Super Nintendo, I get it. Nintendo 64, okay, 64-bit, that makes sense. But Dolphin? Thankfully, that didn't last long. They officially unveiled what would be called the GameCube at a press conference on August 25th, 2000. And while the name felt more grounded, some of Nintendo's choices for the hardware itself stuck out about as much as a dolphin in a game store. After 3 generations of cartridges, Nintendo was finally moving to disc-based media. But not standard DVDs. They opted for a proprietary mini DVD format to control piracy and to reduce costs. That decision meant no DVD playback right at a time when Sony was using DVDs as a major selling point for PlayStation 2. The mini discs also had significantly less storage capacity than standard DVDs, meaning some games would need to span multiple discs, a headache for both developers and players. And the GameCube controller, while genuinely heralded by many as one of the best gamepads ever designed, was still divisive enough that some players found it distancing from the start. And the console's launch falling so close to the events of September 11th also presented a challenge. GameCube launched in Japan on September 14th, 2001, 3 days after the attacks, and then in North America on November 18th. And for a young guy in college about 90 minutes north of New York City, I had lost track of a lot of things in gaming for a while after what had happened. And I have to say, the November launch gave us something to look forward to during an incredibly difficult stretch. And Nintendo had done their homework. They had adequate launch stock ready despite what was going on in the world, and they navigated the supply issues that had plagued both Sony and Sega before them. But something was missing at launch, or rather, someone. I can still remember the genuine confusion in the gaming community that Nintendo was launching a console without a Super Mario game. We already knew that Nintendo was willing to take some interesting swings. That three-handled controller was proof enough, but no Super Mario game at launch? Instead, they led with Luigi's Mansion, a charming, funny, haunted house adventure starring Mario's lanky green brother. And honestly, it was a great game. And look, I'm a big Luigi guy. See? But it was an undeniably strange call. Nevertheless, like every Nintendo console before and since, the GameCube had an excellent first-party lineup throughout its life cycle. Super Smash Bros. Melee, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Metroid Prime, but its toy-like aesthetic, its primarily purple color scheme, its lack of DVD playback, and its pretty thin third-party development support gave it an identity problem that was hard to shake. Was Nintendo going after kids, adults, both? The hardware itself seemed to answer maybe kids first, which made it harder to attract the older gamers who had grown up on GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, and were now hungry for something like GTA 3. And maybe that was intentional. Maybe Nintendo decided that it wasn't their play to chase the maturing gamer demographic, but instead to win the hearts of a new generation of kids and lock them into the Nintendo ecosystem. And maybe that is what the handle is for. We can't know for sure what Nintendo was thinking, but the result was a console that many gamers found genuinely difficult to categorize, even as they really enjoyed it. And me, I was in line for the GameCube launch at the GameStop in my college town. It got real play in my dorm room, which is more than I can say for myself. And I don't regret buying the GameCube for a second, but I have to admit there's a personal reason I was there shelling out money at that GameCube launch not long after doing the exact same thing for Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. Hi, I'm Owen, and I'm a consoleaholic. I acknowledge that I have a problem. I always have. A new game system comes out and I have to have it. Not just want it. I voraciously read every article, I absorb every detail, and I simply cannot rest until I have it in my hands. And I held down jobs all through high school and college just to maintain this habit. And if you're a regular on my channel, you know that that habit continues to this day. And as we go through this console war history together in the coming episodes, I'm going to keep revealing myself as someone who has spent a deeply irresponsible amount of money on home game machines over many years. Such was the case with the Dreamcast, the PS2, and the GameCube. But would it be the case with the final 6th generation console? Well, in 2001, a new challenger was ready to enter the arena. The 3 platform holders we've covered so far, Sega, Sony, and Nintendo, were all Japanese companies that had gone global to dominate the emerging video game market as it rolled out in the 1980s and 90s. And it was no secret that the American computing giant Microsoft was watching the growing console market dominating PC gaming with quite a bit of trepidation. And when PS2 made DVD-ROM its game media, essentially integrating home entertainment right into the device, the challenge to Windows became even more real. So it was the worst kept secret in the industry when late in 1999, then CEO Bill Gates first mentioned Microsoft's intention to build a console. They showed off an X-shaped prototype and some pre-rendered game footage at GDC in March 2000. But it was at CES on January 3rd, 2001 when Microsoft finally officially revealed the Xbox. And it was big in every possible sense. The announcement was big. I mean, yes, CEO and future Epstein Files guest star Bill Gates was there, but they also brought out Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, then absolutely at the height of his wrestling popularity, to help premiere and demo the machine. This was the first American-made home console since Atari's Jaguar back in 1993. And Microsoft had planned a massive launch event in Times Square. That was big. And the console itself? Also big. Xbox was a chunky beast compared to the PS2 and absolutely dwarfed the GameCube, and it had a lot of power under the hood. Its big size came with substance, where Nintendo and Sony had opted for optional network add-ons. Xbox shipped with a dedicated Ethernet port built right in, far more capable for online gaming than Dreamcast's dial-up modem, and far more convenient than Sony and Nintendo's add-on accessories. But the real online headline wasn't even the hardware. It was Xbox Live, Microsoft's online gaming system available for a fee, enabling worldwide online multiplayer. And with Halo Combat Evolved launching as a launch title on Xbox, the system was practically designed to be a test case for what online gaming could look like in a console ecosystem. So Xbox Live was genuinely a big deal. The console also shipped with an actual onboard hard disk drive, a first for a home console, to support that online service and game saves. That disk drive added to the footprint and to the weight for sure. But if you were there for the 6th generation, you know what was really big: the controller. The original Xbox gamepad, nicknamed the Duke, was just too big. And look, I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4", I'm 100 pounds. I'm not a petite person, and I've got decent-sized mitts. But the Duke was too big even for me, let alone the friends sitting next to me on the couch who were smaller. If the N64 controller had been divisive, the Duke ignited an outright war. Some gamers swore by its offset joystick layout, its 6 face buttons, breakaway cables, and excellent rumble motors. Others, like me, considered it sort of an abomination. I vastly prefer this smaller S model of the controller that initially was bundled with the system in Japan and later went on sale worldwide. But I'll give Microsoft this: they were making a statement. The Xbox was big and they made sure that everybody knew it. And here in the US, despite the rocket ship trajectory of PS2, which had launched a year before, Microsoft succeeded in generating genuinely massive hype by the time the system launched on November 15th, 2001. Microsoft's Xbox had beaten Nintendo's GameCube to American shelves by 3 days. And some logistics had gotten complicated by the events of September 11th, but Microsoft achieved an unbelievable feat. They hit a record-breaking console launch for the industry, moving more than 1.5 million consoles by the end of 2001, less than a month and a half. And Halo was a genuine breakout hit. That said, the full picture for Xbox is a little bit more complicated. Xbox comfortably outsold both the GameCube and the Dreamcast, moving 24 million units total over its life cycle. A solid debut. But more than 16 million of those units were in the United States alone. Microsoft had capitalized on Western market hype, but they struggled in Japan and Europe, where Sony continued to rack up massive numbers. And the hardware itself, built largely on PC components, was especially expensive to manufacture. Microsoft had priced it to match PS2 at $299, but that price didn't cover their costs. And they reportedly lost somewhere in the vicinity of about $4 billion on the original Xbox. But they had made a statement. They had put a foothold down in the industry, and they had brought something genuinely different to the table. But for me, Microsoft's first Xbox marked the rare console that I actually didn't buy at launch. And that was partially because I had already spent $199 each on launch day models of the Dreamcast and GameCube and $299 on the launch day PS2. I already had history with the three other platforms. I already had relationships with their game libraries, and their controllers were in my muscle memory. It wasn't fanboy stubbornness that kept me from buying one, it was that I was a broke college student whose RA lived down the hall and had gotten one on launch day, so I could just go down and play anytime I wanted. But I'm glad that I was able to find this Xbox for this video. And it was even in its box. Actually, I tracked down all of these consoles for this video. I never held on to any of my old systems. I'm not responsible enough for that. I always sold them for credit at GameStop and sometimes even bought them again only to sell them again. I'm not proud of it. It's a habit that continues to this day. And if I'm being honest, if my RA hadn't had one down the hall, I probably would have found some irresponsible way to scrounge up enough money to get one of these things back when I was in college. The bold green menus, the futuristic fonts, Halo, it felt like Microsoft had succeeded in laying down something of a genuine marker. Especially in the US, they had established a foothold in the console world. And that foothold was only going to grow into something much bigger during the much more bombastic 7th console generation that was still to come. But that's another story for another day. Even if I didn't have one back then, I still look back on the original Microsoft Xbox with a lot of fondness. With Sega having folded so quickly after the Dreamcast and with Nintendo wrestling with something of an identity crisis through the GameCube years, I was genuinely glad that Microsoft had stepped into the arena. Competition makes everyone better. We had already seen that with Super Nintendo and Genesis. And the industry needed it again. So while I did the majority of my gaming on PS2 during this era, I'm glad that Microsoft showed up to push everyone, and that arrival would shape everything that has come after it. But when I think about this console generation as a whole, though, it's hard to even call it a war, because it was a period of just absolute dominance for Sony. PlayStation 2 remains to this day the best-selling console of all time. But despite that dominance, by the 6th generation, the video game industry had matured enough that 3 other competitors had a presence in the market during this era. Nintendo turned a profit on the GameCube. Microsoft moved 24 million Xbox units in their debut generation. And Sega even sold nearly 10 million Dreamcasts despite officially discontinuing the system in March of 2001. And look, none of these 6th generation consoles are my favorite of all time. I'm not even sure any of them crack my top 3. But the 6th generation overall as an era? It might be my favorite in all of video game history. All 4 platforms felt distinct from one another. The industry was being covered and discussed differently. Not as a toy category, but now as a legitimate entertainment medium. There was celebrity power behind these launches. There were midnight lines. There were emotional promises and massive ambitions. And there was comparatively very little of the fanboy strife and toxic tribalism that was coming. We weren't deep into the online troll era yet. It was nice. It was still mostly just about the games. And we had 4 unique, well-crafted platforms to play them on. And for me, it was an era best described as being greater than the sum of its parts. And I don't think that I could have picked a better generation to start with for the save files. But what games do you remember most from this era? Do you have any that you still play today? Did you go multi-platform during this generation like I did? Or was there one console that had your heart and loyalty throughout this generation? Drop me a note in the comments. I'd love to connect and to reminisce. Till next time, I'm Owen, the friendly Xennial gamer. Thanks so much for taking this trip with me. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, you can support the channel by subscribing, hitting like, and sharing to help new viewers find their way here. Thanks so much for watching and for your support.